In addition to his own writing, Gregory Orr has served as an editor for the Virginia Quarterly Review for close to 25 years, or perhaps slightly more. The awards he has achieved are equally numerous. Again, I'll only mention a few. He received a Guggenheim Fellowship, as well as a fellowship from the National Endowment of the Arts. In 2003, he received the award in literature by the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a very prestigious award. He has also been a social activist and has lived out his beliefs in a way that I think we can all admire. That's part of Aquinas' urgings for us. Gregory Orr is currently teaching at the University of Virginia in the MFA program, which he founded. Even that impressive listing of his accomplishments does not provide a sense of Gregory Orr's overwhelming significance as a writer. He has contributed to the world of literature as a lyric poet, and his work will remain with us. His work offers us the hope of grace in the midst of deep trauma. It offers us meaning in a world that is often violent, turbulent, and unpredictable. A world that often appears indifferent and meaningless. But in the midst of this seeming isolation, Gregory Orr uses language to witness and explore the mystery of human life, its pain, suffering, and turmoil. And at the same time, he reminds us of the beauty of being alive. And in doing so, his work offers us hope and courage and the grace to survive in the midst of it all. I'd like to close with Gregory Orr's words about poetry. And this, I believe, essay that was read on National Public Radio and also published in their collections, he says this about poetry. I believe in poetry as a way of surviving the emotional chaos, spiritual confusions, and traumatic events that come with being alive. Will you please welcome Gregory Orr with me?
Thank you, and thank you, Linda. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I've got the flu. I don't usually like these mics, but I think I'm going to rely on it tonight. Let's see. I've got glasses, and see, I was seeing double. I thought it was the flu, but it's the glasses. Okay, so I think it can be helpful to try to orient people a little about what it is you think you're doing as a poet, because after all, one of the joys and perils of poetry at this time in our culture is that it can be almost any kind of thing that the poet says it is. And so it seems to me the least I can do is try to give you a sense of where I am, as we used to say in my generation, coming from. Okay. So I think of myself as a lyric poet, which is to say that basically trying to concentrate as much as possible into as short a space as possible, usually focused around a single scene or emotion or event. On the other hand, as a lyric poet, valuing this, I've always envied narrative poets who could extend their poems across more time and stuff like that. So for the last several times, books, and this most recent book that I'm going to read from, what I've been doing is lyric sequences, which is sort of unfolding storylines of lyric poems so that I can get both stretching out over time of a story and try to get that concentrated moment of lyric as well. And the first one I'm going to read from is called Eden and After. And again, one of the wonderful things about writing poems based on myths is you don't have to make up the story. It's already been done. The other thing about it, of course, is that everybody knows this story. That's, in an odd kind of way, that's the point about myths. We know the story, and yet every time we hear it, it's a retelling of it. That is to say, it's a re-understanding or an attempt to find something else in it. And of course, the belief is that mythic stories have in them, some kind of heart mystery that's inexhaustible. I hope I'm not offending anybody by referencing Eden as a mythic realm, but we'll have time. We can talk about that if you want. Let's not do it now. Let me get a little started.
Not all of us are fundamentalists. It's
Okay,
okay.
that's all I needed to know. We can do this. Okay, so I'm going to move through this. The other thing about being a poet is that you're obsessed with language. You're totally fascinated by what language does or could do or doesn't do. And so almost all the poems in this Eden and After have titles that are infinitives, like to speak, to see, to write, to name. So there are also considerations of language and how that plays through that story. To speak. It hadn't occurred to God to use words. He'd simply thought the world into being, merely imagined those animals, that shrub. But he was proud of what he'd done. He didn't want to boast, but still, he felt an urge. He cleared his throat and spoke. To see. True, as time passed, Adam's eyes would weary the world with looking, would wear away the sheen it wore as sheath and shield. But now, in his first gaze, each object gleamed, slick and shiny, with its afterbirth of light. It shone in watery silence, with only sight connecting it to him and him to everything. So after seeing, he decides to write. To write. What was inside Adam swirled about, but outside, all was still and held its shape. How negotiate between these worlds, the one that whirled, the one that waited to be designated? Lifting a stick, he drew marks in the dirt, idle doodles and arbitrary scratches. Animals approached, leaned over his shoulder. They wondered at what he wrote. So then, of course, there's that moment where language, where God decides to parade before Adam all the creatures. I guess he parades the shrubs and trees too, but I don't know how that worked. Anyway, that naming is of course this amazing moment of connecting through language with the world, but of course it's also an ambiguous moment because in Genesis it says that at this point, with those words, Adam took dominion over the earth and all the creatures. And of course the word dominion is is pretty complicated because it means absolute power of a king or an emperor, and needless to say, that's not a viable relationship with the natural world. Thank you, Greg, for that little commentary. Okay, back to the parade. So anyway, I was imagining this parade. There's no snake in my Eden. There is an earthworm in this, but there's no snake. Parade. As they paraded past, Adam named them all. That is, all he saw. Some were too busy to heed God's call. Others were hidden. Some, like the worm, were both. Its mouth was full. It was chewing its way through earth. A pink needle tugging a black thread of tunnel, stitching a dark shroud. And of course, the conflict ultimately in the Eden that I'm imagining here has to do with nouns and verbs. You can see how that would. I can't explain. Let me try to read the poems. Anyway, my feeling was that God wanted nouns. He wanted to stick to nouns, and ultimately, Adam and Eve, especially by way of Eve, came to prefer verbs. To noun. Nouns were a giant confining. Adam felt the sounds he made build bars around the things he saw. It hurt and thrilled him to see how meekly each thing entered that cage. How snug it fit, how smug he felt. To verb. The beasts were beasting, the birds birding about. Everywhere Adam looked, he saw moving tokens of becoming's task. Clearly, their glory was spoken as motion. But to praise them, he needed more precise words. Floating, sniffing, gliding, drifting, burrowing, soaring, grunting, roaring. He'd poked among the shrubs and noted they were stable. Now he gazed at birds flying wherever they whimmed. Maybe his tongue was a root, but weren't his verbs wings? So the conflict intensifies here. As I reach for my water. Not conflict exactly. Anyway, we've gotten to the point of to choose. God planned a static planet with plants that bore no offspring, as if acts had no consequence. But Eve was there to change all that by choosing, to show Adam losing was illusion if you took it all inside you. The bright fruit, the garden's beauty, the day's delight, and the night sky with its stars. Show him how, within you, it would ripen and give birth to things beyond yourself and your imaginings. We go through an X-rated section, so I'm not going to read. Then we get to embrace. With their embrace, they chose each other, which is to choose death and all that comes before it. Sufferings and joys and infinite unintended harms. Large choice for such small arms. They're booted. They're booted. Let's see. They're out of the garden. They're wandering off. Here we go. Here we go. Let's see. And then I'll just move to the end, which is to build the last poem in the sequence. They're outside the garden now. No longer could they rest each night inside God's breath, as in a tent that kept them from the cold. All this was new, was after Eden. No longer could they sleep beneath the trees, trusting branches not to break. It was a habitation they had to make, 4 walls and a roof, a place to live, a world inside the world. The second sequence is something called the City of Poetry. And if Adam and Eve were at the beginning of this story, it seems to me that this place called the City of Poetry comes somewhere in the present story of our human lives. It just occurred to me one day that there's this place called the City of Poetry. And it consists of, every time somebody writes a poem in this world, this house pops up in the City of Poetry, right? Right? I mean, there it is, and it's there. And then when someone reads a poem, what they really do is they go visit the house in the City of Poetry. And that makes sense. That's obvious. And let's see. So there's this gigantic city because all the poems have become houses. Good news for poets is that when you die, you go to live in the City of Poetry. And you go to live in the house of your poems, and you hang out with Whitman and Sylvia Plath and all the other cheery folk, and William Blake, and you hang out in the bars, and there it is. You're in the City of Poetry. So that's the City of Poetry. So this is a little bit of a guidebook to the City of Poetry and a sort of story about the city. And it's also woven through events in my own life as I sort of learn about the City of Poetry. It was the only way I could think. I mean, I'm always trying to think of ways in which how this, what seems to me a gigantic emotional treasure house of poetry, by which I would have to add, I mean, rock and roll as well. You know, I mean, I don't see any difference between, it's all the same thing. I don't see how we could live without it. It clearly exists in some sense outside of time, because I can still listen to Buddy Holly, whom you've never heard of. But he's still there, and he's still singing. So obviously there's this place, you know, inside and outside of time. I'm sorry, you're not interested in that. So this is the beginning. I guess one of the things that interests me about poetry is that it seems to be the opportunity to make a human statement against oblivion, against the way that everything vanishes and disappears. And as I say, I think with the City of Poetry, we've not only is it an individual statement, but it's a kind of collective social statement about what it is to be alive. These don't have any titles. It would have erased everything human, the deep snow of oblivion, if those before us hadn't kept poking up the huts of poems. And then small houses huddled in a settlement. And soon it became a village. And next it was a town. And now it makes its own weather. Now the winds walk around it. Now the clouds bow. Now the snow recedes from the shining city. Some say Adam and Eve made it, she from her praise, he from his grief. Some say they built it out of their fallenness, he with his praise, she from her grief. Raising the walls, laying the roof, she with her praise, he with his grief, building the first house of song. She with her grief, he with his praise, making the holy human city, making the holy human city. There was a pun in there, which I forgot to tell you about. The first time I say holy, it's sacred. The second time, it's completely human. Holy, complete. Things you can't say after you've read the poem. Anything. Here we start weaving in some of the experiences. I killed my younger brother in a hunting accident when I was 12. 2 years later, my mother took sick and died in a single night. My world closed in on all sides. I could hardly breathe. If someone had told me then, a place where every poem is a house and every house a poem. When I first came here 50 years ago, the moment I arrived, I knew this city was my home. Another one, this is mentions, this one's set in 1965 in Hayneville, Alabama. Very small town in Alabama. Don't go there. And the Keats poem is Keats' Ode to a Nightingale. 18 and a volunteer in the movement. I was kidnapped at gunpoint in rural Alabama and imprisoned in a solitary cell in a murderous town. Oddly, after the beatings and threats, they let me keep a book of Keats. I was sick and scared. It seemed likely I would die there. I read his Nightingale Ode, how he rose above his woes. The poem was my ladder, rungs and lifts of escape. I read it at dusk, climbing with each line, and I was there with that bird I could just glimpse by shinnying up the bars of my cell. Mockingbird in the magnolia across the moonlit road. One of the gifts, it seems to me, that poetry gives us, I guess along with alcohol, drugs, dancing, and a few other bad things, but poetry is not illegal, most states. That sense of release, of ecstasy. Give me the Beat Boys and free my soul. I want to get lost in your rock and roll and drift away. That's about poetry. That's what poetry does. So I was imagining these different houses there, what they might look like. William Blake and Baudelaire, the Chinese poet. I'm not going to read those poems. Who cares? That's a good poem if you want to read it sometime. I'm going to do something else. What am I going to do? By the way, I hate this when poets decide to change their reading in the middle. So unprofessional. Don't waste our time. I'm going to read this. This will be a description of some poets' houses, another description. These are poets who don't live in houses. They're just on the outer limits of civilization. Poet named Rimbaud, a French poet. Sappho, ancient Greek poet. Rumi, Sufi, religious poet. Poet named Trockle, may not know of. A very sad individual who wrote wonderful poems and then died at 26 of an overdose. So anyway, this is a group of poets that don't live in houses. Not everyone in the city sleeps in a house. Rimbaud vagabonds about, a youth with backpack, dog, and homemade tattoos. His poems too restless to settle, appearing as phrases on walls, bold and disturbing, making us uneasy, a sacred demonic graffiti. And Sappho, who's known to us only in fragments, it follows that she doesn't have a house, only a gown, and that's in tatters. Linen like gauze, and where it's torn, revealing the body beneath, slender and passionate. But don't pity her. It's a garment that flatters. Nor will Rumi permit a roof. He won't have any barrier between the infinite and him. You'll find him in a great open space where he dances on one foot, then the other. You could say his house is the pillar of dust his spinning raises up, and he stands inside it, singing. And Trockle, each night after dark, stumbles into the park and clambers up into the outstretched marble arms of an angel and curls up in a ball. Wadded poems stuffed in his clothes will keep him warm. Angel of cocaine, angel of his suicide sister, angel of atonement. Who knows? Who knows? He sleeps like a child after a fever. He sleeps as if all was forgiven. This is the last poem in that sequence. I guess what seems to me one of the things that I grant you that I have an unnaturally intense relationship to poetry, because that's my job. If I didn't, I could be fired. But I mean, I think all of us as products of American culture have that kind of relationship with popular music, which is just that it has the ability to transport us, to take us out of ourselves to another place. And it seems to me, of course, when we hear a song from 5 and 10 years back in our lives that we loved, we're taken back to that time, or we're taken outside of our present moment. So anyway, last poem in the sequence. As I say aloud the opening line of my favorite poem, my breath calms. Soon the sounds I make set my hands dancing, and next my feet begin to move. Before I know it, I'm walking again in the city, my strides jaunty, my legs feel strong. I'm an old man, made young again by the poems I love, reciting them as I saunter along. In the third lyric sequence in the book is a continuation of a sequence that I began 2 books earlier. It's untitled lyric poems that move around this phrase that I heard in my head one day and became the start of a bunch of poems. I guess it became a kind of myth that I have, which is the phrase was, the book that is the resurrection of the body of the beloved, which is the world. And when I heard that phrase, I knew exactly what the book was. I mean, the book is like the City of Poetry. It's this gigantic anthology that contains all the poems and songs ever written. And it's like just there. It's like a humongous iPod the size of the moon. What is its purpose? Besides shining on us, its purpose is so that we can download what we need to live, right? That's what the book is there for. That's what the City of Poetry is there. Visit when we need it. So it's a part of, I guess, the same myth. Resurrection of the body, the beloved. The beloved to me was, again, it was very clear. It's the other outside us that calls us into relation, calls us into love. The beloved, it seems to me, can be a person. It can be a creature. My dog is definitely one of my beloveds. Yeah. Be one of your beloveds, too, if you knew her, but you don't. Great dog, beloved dog. It could be a place, you know? The beloved is just something that brings us out of the self, out of that trap of self, into the world. And it seems to me that one of the products of that is a kind of resurrection, not a physical resurrection after death, but a resurrection within our lifespan, a bringing alive again. Because it seems to me, and I may be just speaking for myself, but I spend half my time half dead or sleepwalking or something, and then so I need to be constantly resurrected. So I'm going to read about a few poems from different places in the sequence, some from the new book, but other places too. None of them have titles. This is one that begins and ends with a quote, quoted phrase. What is life? What is life? When you first hear that question, it echoes in your skull as if someone shouted in an empty cave. The same answer each time. The resurrection of the body of the beloved, which is the world. Every poem different, but telling the same story. And we've been gathering them in a book since writing began. And before that, as songs or poems people memorized and recited aloud when someone asked, "What is life?" The book said we were mortal. It didn't say we had to be morbid. The book said the beloved died, but also that she comes again, that he's reborn as words. The book said everything perishes. The book said that's why we sing. Each of us standing at a particular spot we favor, our own location along the mortal shore. scanning the horizon. There it is. We watch the boat of the book float by. All our beloveds on board, waving from the deck, calling out our name. Some of them singing, some just looking at us, gazing at us with that look we loved. There are different kinds of beloveds. Cat curled asleep on my lap, beloved as love sponge. Dog gazing up from the floor, all calm and liquid eyes, all fountain. That surplus, that overflow, give it away, give it away. How much more than we can absorb the beloved bestows. When the coffin closed at last, when flames consumed it, your eyes were useless. What tears could put out that fire? And so you shut them. So you let the lids of your eyes close over the beloved's body. For a while now, darkness. And what you see will be inside you. I did mention that the poems are short, right? To be alive, not just the carcass, but the spark. That's crudely put, but if we're not supposed to dance, why all this music? Turns out that's my favorite poem, so I get to request it, read it again. Greg, would you read that again? Yes, I will. Thank you. Read it differently this time. To be alive, not just the carcass, but the spark. That's crudely put, but if we're not supposed to dance, why all this music? It's funny, isn't it? Isn't it funny? I think that's funny. I'll find another funny one if you don't think that's funny. If any of you are fans of William Blake, yeah, okay. So he's got this poem called Tiger, the Tiger. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night. It's kind of a wonderful, scary poem about whether the creator God that created the lamb could also have created this tiger. And so I thought I was hunting for a poem. Hours spent leafing through dusty books, huge anthologies. And all the time, the poem was stalking me. Tiger, burning in the forests of the night, eager to devour my heart. No, not my whole heart, only the rotten parts. Only what needed to be renewed. Only what needed. The world so huge and dark, it swallows our cry. But we're no longer lost. The beloved has heard us and even now approaches. We move toward each other like two words that will join in a poem. A small poem, a little song, but one in which we're not alone. We're almost there, folks. You're going to make it. You'll make it, I'll make it, we'll all make it. If I can find it.
Write a song on myself.
Song of the beloved self is what I want to write. Oh, my. So embarrassing. How beautiful the beloved, whether garbed in mortal tatters or in her dress of everlastingness, moon broken on the water, or moon still whole in the night sky. Praising all creation, praising the world. That's our job, to keep the sweet machine of it running as smoothly as it can. With words repairing where it wears out, where it breaks down. With songs and poems keeping it going. With whispered endearments greasing its gears. One of my favorite places is a place in the ocean when you're on a sandy beach where you're sort of up to your waist and you're not going to be knocked down by the waves, but you're in that powerful motion of the waves, and the sand coming out under your feet as the wave goes back out. Loss and loss and more loss. That's what the sea teaches. The need to stay nimble against the suck of receding waves, the sand disappearing under our feet. Here, where sea meets shore, the best of dancing floors. Squander it all, hold nothing back. The heart's a deep well, and when it's empty, it will fill again. Just 2 more poems, and we made it. Hoarding your joys and despairs as if they were clothes you bought but never wore. Look at this bright shirt, a possibility you glimpsed but feared to seize. The beloved is waiting. You have a date. Put on that shirt before it fades. River inside the river, world within the world. All we have is words to reveal the rose that the rose obscures. Thank you.
Mr. Orr has graciously agreed to field some Q&A, some questions about what he does, how he does.
Yeah, of course, that can be like a threat. Like, wait a minute, you mean we can't get out of here yet? So, yeah,
So,
but,
yes.
yeah, but I do love this part. This is where I get a little back.
One of the themes they broached in the first poem was this tension between how should I live? Should I go with what the verbs seem to, direct me toward, or should I figure out the essences, the noun?
Yeah, yeah.
And so Adam is trying to figure out, what do I need to do given my confusion?
Yeah.
So what was your solution? Should he figure out reality before he needs to act? And then I
Yeah.
wondered why Eve wasn't consulted, because I think Eve was
Yeah.
patient with his inability to make any decisions.
No, not my story. In my story, she does all the deciding. She has an intuitive grasp of the verbness of the world that they're in, of the possibilities of verbs. And also the possibilities of verbs of living in the world are also the condemnation to die in the world. So yeah, Adam's just a jerk in my story. I mean, he means well, but he never gets anything.
When you suggested the City of Poetry and the anthology,
Yeah.
everything we've got out there, we can just download it.
Absolutely.
To figure out how to live. Well, that presupposes you already know what program to download. And
Well-
you can understand it once you download it.
Why do you take English classes if not to find out? I mean, look, you take this course and it says 800 great poems. Well, that's bullshit. There are no such, a poem is only good if it helps you live. Or like a rock and roll song is only good if it helps you live. Doesn't matter whether it gets to number one or not. And it's the same thing with poetry. We get paid professionally as English professors to maybe rank the poems and say, this is a great poet, this is a half-great poet, this is a half-baked poet. It's all nonsense. It doesn't have anything to do with the human urgency and motive behind poetry, which is how do we live? One of the answers is poetry and song. Another answer is philosophy. Another answer is religion. They all have something to contribute to that question. But to me, as a poet, I get excited about what poetry and song have to contribute to that. How do we find out what to download? That's our job. That's our quest. That's if failing to do it. Emerson talks about. He says, look. You have to be an active soul. You can't be a passive soul. You have to be an active soul. And one of the active soul projects, it seems to me, as someone who has themselves been saved by poetry in some ways, is your task is to find the poems and songs you need to live.
Poets are liberating gods.
I'm sorry?
Quote verbatim, poets are liberating gods.
Yes, that's Emerson. Poets are liberating. He's getting a little hyperbolic there, but yeah. But what he does, I'll say, here's what he says to himself in one of his notebooks. He says, make your own Bibles. He said, put together everything, every piece of writing that you've ever come across, a poem, a phrase of prose, a piece of philosophy, anything. Put together this sacred text that can sustain you as an individual. Make your own Bible. And it doesn't mean that the Bible you inherited or the Quran that you inherited is not going to do a lot of the work for you too. Of course, it's not the issue. The issue is that as an active soul, we have to partake in our own. It seems to me our own salvation by. Oh man, salvation by poetry. I didn't say that. I am not a nut.
Yes.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could say a little more about something you said a few minutes ago. You talked about downloading.
Oh, that was her word, but it's a good word. Yeah, because that's what we use now.
So that you could have it when you need it. I wonder if you could talk about what do you mean by when you need it.
Different ways of going about that. One is that it's a good idea to start putting it together in case you're going to need it. And I think we know the poems that we absolutely love or the songs we absolutely love, it's not because they're great songs. It's because they're saying something to us about us that we need to hear. So I think you can actively gather them before, and in a sense, you're gathering together the spiritual and emotional and imagistic, imaginative resources that can sustain you. So you've already done it in a way. And you will fall back on it just as you'll fall back on religion and whatever else you got. Maybe philosophy, although I have to say I've yet to meet somebody facing death who found philosophy useful. But we will talk about that some other time. I hope there's some philosophy professors in here who differ. Anyway, the other thing is that sometimes we spontaneously find them. One of the things that we noticed with 9/11 was that many, many, many people discovered W.H. Auden's September 3rd, 1939, which is a poem he wrote about on the eve of the outbreak of World War II. And it's a very dark poem, but it's a poem about how to sustain yourself you sustain yourself as a member of civilization in a time when it looks like the lights of civilization are going out and possibly going out for good. And that poem just came out of nowhere and was emailed all over the place and put up and stuff. It obviously, so I have to say that there's also something, there's a kind of collective social project sometimes that brings a poem forward when we need it. That poem was very important in a time when I think every single person in America was both shocked and deeply confused. And it's a bleak poem, but it's not without hope. Yeah.
You told us how you how you accidentally killed your brother and how you were traumatized and everything.
Yeah.
Was poetry kind of a medium for you to find therapy or relief?
Well, I want to say yes, except that all those terms have kind of like, next thing you know, people are going to start saying, oh, poetry is just therapy or something, as if like therapeutic was not based on the word healing.
It kind of became part
Yeah.
of your soul as it kind
Absolutely. No, absolutely.
of how it worked.
What happened for me was this. To be traumatized is among other things, to have meaning destroyed, to have a sense of meaning in the world destroyed. Also, in a sense, to have a sense of self destroyed. That's one of the aspects of trauma. So for me, I had these just kind of huge negations. My brother's death and my responsibility for it, my mother's death 2 years later overnight. And I just thought, wow, okay, there's no meaning here, What do you do? And I felt there were two things that I could do. One was social activism. And I joined the civil rights movement in the mid-'60s and had some misadventures in the Deep South that were mentioned. And the other thing I did was start writing under the guidance of a high school librarian in my little town where I grew up. And writing poetry for me was a magical healing. It was a way to both express what was inside me and also to escape what's inside me, both of which I think are two extremely important motives for poetry, for all humans to write poems, And so I have a book called Poetry is Survival, and I'm stuck with it, being the person who with a straight face will say, yeah, this is what poetry is for. This is why culture invented poetry, because people have this stuff inside them, and whatever it is, and it can be joy, it can be falling in love, for crying out loud, I mean, it's not always negative. Good Lord. Anybody who's ever fallen madly in love knows that that's about the worst thing that can happen to you in terms of emotional stability, right? I mean, forget it. If you're deluded about that, check with me later and I'll explain it to you. It is not a good thing. Read Othello. Read Romeo and Juliet. These things do not work out. Oddly enough, we never learned that lesson here. But you need the same thing. You need poetry to help you cope with it. You write a love poem anyway, even if you are crazy. Well, this is past your bedtime. Will, thank you very much. You're a wonderful audience.